So Ambassador Bryan, thank you so much for joining us today. Let me just start out. I mean, I think you could go to Ukraine or China. We can kind of do the geography around the world trip, which we will do. But I want to ask you, from your best impression, how are we doing? We collectively, Republicans, Democrats, President Biden, President Trump, in positioning America's interests in the world today? Because it seems to me that the world is very fragile, and I'm not sure we're getting it right. So I'd just love to hear how you see things from your perspective.
Well, thanks, Stephen. It's great to be for the Global Security Forum in Doha and to come back again, having been here before, and to be with you, Steve. So that's a great question. I mean, I think the world is always safer and more secure when America leads. And I believe in something that Ronald Reagan referred to as peace through strength. And I think when there's a strong America, the world's more peaceful, America's more at peace. And to the extent that there's fragility in the world, as you point out, I think it will benefit from strong American leadership. But again, that's leadership because people are following, our allies are following, our friends and our partners, and our adversaries respect us, understand that there are red lines, and we need to make sure that that's a posture that America takes. Sometimes we get that right, sometimes we get it wrong. But generally, I think for the fundamentals of America, I'm bullish and optimistic. It's not my party that's in office right now, but I'm optimistic about the future of the world and the future of our country, and I think America will continue to lead throughout the next century.
You know, I've known a few national security advisors, including you, and two of those that really helped mentor me and my understanding of the world were Brent Scowcroft and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And they kind of drilled into me that sometimes White Houses need to ignore some conflicts, that you can't chase every conflict in the world and every cause in the world. America does have limited resources, and you need to be careful of America falling into a trap from which it cannot extract itself. But then there are some challenges you go into, but that by doing so, you can make them defining challenges. They become so important that winning or losing has, disordinate, incredible ramifications for how the rest of the world looks at your power. Is Ukraine now a defining challenge for the United States in your view?
I think so, and I think both Zig and Brent they're both great national security advisors and great men, and we miss them. But their advice to you, I think, was good advice. Their mentorship. America can't be the world's policeman, but what we can be is an example. So while we may not be in every conflict, we may not be there for every human rights violation or every wrong that needs to be righted. We can be that city on a hill that Ronald Reagan talked about, and a beacon of hope and liberty that others can look to. Even if we're not engaged at that moment. But with respect to your question, I think Ukraine is a defining moment. And I think certainly for the Ukrainian people, and I applaud their bravery and their courage and the panache and the boldness with which they've resisted the Russian occupation. I mean, everyone thought this would be over in 2 or 3 weeks, and instead the Ukrainians have fought the Russians to a standstill. Hopefully there'll be a spring offensive in which Ukraine can recover more of its territory that was taken in the initial days of the invasion, and maybe even more. So I think the Ukrainians get the lion's share of the credit. I think sometimes in the West, we want to pat ourselves on the back because we're supplying equipment and material and weapon systems. But it's the Ukrainians who are doing the hard work, the fighting and the dying for their country. And I think they're a great example to the rest of the world. But I think others are watching. And certainly in Beijing and Tehran, two regional power, or one global power and one regional power that would like to take over their smaller neighbors, just as Russia tried to do with Ukraine. And I think they're watching to see how the world reacts to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and how that influences their policy, whether it's with Taiwan, respect to Taiwan, or countries in the Gulf or the Middle East that Iran would like to impose its dominion over.
Representative Michael McCaul, who chairs the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has been out waving flags and ringing bells and saying we have a real problem that America is deploying so many resources into Ukraine, giving so much into this conflict, that over there in Asia, maybe we're creating incentives for China, that if China were to invade Taiwan, like a lot of folks in the intelligence community think might happen in a few years, does Michael McCaul have a point that if we were to have a conflict next week in Taiwan, that we would not be in a position to actually deal with a kinetic conflict with China in Asia while we're flooding Ukraine with lots of military assets?
Yeah, so it's a real concern. Our defense industrial base has been a bit fragile. This is something we pointed out in the Trump administration and started the work on fixing. I think the Biden administration is following up with our programs and policies, and we're trying to make that defense industrial base more robust, so they can have more outputs. We used to be able
So
to
I just want to say here, the Biden administration is carrying on the Trump administration's policy from your perspective.
in a lot of places, especially the Indo-Pacific, and I think that's been a surprise to some. It doesn't surprise me. Jake Sullivan's a smart guy. Kurt Campbell, who the coordinator for Indo-Pacific, is a smart guy. They're experienced in this region, and they're carrying on those policies. But look, we've got to strengthen our industrial base. There's no question about it. We've got to be able to have more outputs come through. We've got to be able to build more Patriots and Stingers and Javelins and LASMs and other weapon systems that are important for the fight, not just in Ukraine, but as you point out in the Indo-Pacific, Steve. But here's one thing I'd caution our adversaries. For those who think that, who are going to bet against America or think that we're not going to be able to handle both supplying the Ukrainians and dealing with the Chinese and Taiwan, they're in for a rude awakening. And I would caution our friends in Beijing to not believe their own propaganda, not necessarily, believe that America is incapable of handling both Ukraine and Taiwan at the same time. I believe we can do both. But again, the longer Ukraine goes on, the more we're going to have to up our game. And look, again, this is something we have to do with partners and allies. So we need the Germans heavily involved. They haven't been to the extent they should be. We need the other European countries involved, but we need countries like South Korea and Japan and other countries to support Ukraine. But we'll be able to handle any contingency that comes up in Taiwan. I'm not unduly concerned about that. It would be bloody. It would be a sharp conflict. If the Chinese decide to invade Taiwan, it would be a major mistake, just like Putin made a major mistake invading Ukraine. But America has a few things up our sleeves that even the Chinese with their excellent espionage programs and their balloons and all that sort of thing, we've got a few tricks up our sleeves.
Balloons, really excellent espionage. I mean, I don't want to go too far down it, but balloon is not excellent espionage, right? It's like low level espionage. But anyway, I don't know.
I will point out it was carrying 3 busloads of collection equipment with high-tech cameras and video and SIGINT collection materials. It could maneuver. And look, the Chinese are trying to dominate every part of the ISR spectrum. So from high Earth orbit satellites to low Earth orbit satellites to balloons to long-range drones. They're taking.
Well, I'm going to ask you a question about Taiwan, but I have a source, pretty good source, who has told me that the thing that really ticked off President Biden and Jake Sullivan over the balloon was we contacted the Chinese and said, hey, your balloon's gone off course. It's a problem. It's collecting information. And that the Chinese could have turned off the data collection material and they left it on. Now, that hasn't been reported anywhere, but I'll just say I got it from a good source. But I mean, what does that say to you if in fact that is true, that after we communicated, the White House called the Chinese and said, hey, oops, you caused some trouble. If they didn't turn off the data collection as it went off over Offutt Air Base.
Well, yeah, it's beyond that. I mean, it lingered over the missile silos. It went over Offutt, where we've got the second leg of our triad. And then it took some, it was over our sub pens on the East Coast. So not only did they not turn it off, but they continued on exactly on their collection routine that they were on. Now, we had countermeasures, and I think those were probably effective, but it was very brazen. And the Chinese meant to humiliate us. And it shows how little they think of the United States of America. And our country's been underestimated before, Steve. And the Chinese may be so arrogant now and so nationalistic that they think they can get away with things. And look, maybe looking at the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the failure to deter Putin in Ukraine, the lack of sanctions on Putin. I mean, the Russian economy is doing pretty well, notwithstanding the sanctions that have been implemented. Maybe the Chinese think they're going to pass, but I don't think they're going to pass in Taiwan. And I think America is woke up as a result of it. We talk about wokeness. I think all of America got very woke to Chinese espionage after the balloon. And you're seeing things like today's New York Times article detailing the extensive nature of Chinese espionage. I think they've lost America. And I think average Americans understand what the Chinese are up to. And you're seeing the Congressional Committee, Mike Gallagher's committee, and other efforts that are being undertaken. This isn't going to be solved by a Chinese charm offensive or and ending of Wolf warrior diplomacy, the Chinese are going to have to change their conduct with respect to the United States of America, or it's not going to go well for them.
Let me ask you a question about Taiwan. I've thought a lot recently about America's doubling down on now investing and reinvesting in the chips industry, reshoring and attracting back the highest quality chip makers. It's going to take some time to do that. But the crown jewels in the world of everything smart, efficient, next generation tech require chips, and those chips are made in Taiwan. And I'm just sitting here saying, is this too attractive a target for China while it sees America distracted in Russia? For China to come in and say, hey, we want those chips for ourselves and we're going to take that whole capacity. Is America going to let that happen?
No, we're not going to let it happen. And look, the Chinese are looking at Taiwan for three reasons. One, geopolitically, it's the cork in the Pacific. That cork pops open. The Chinese get access to it. They control the whole Pacific. They cut off our allies in the north, South Korea and Japan, from our allies in the south, the ANZUS powers and the Philippines and Thailand and other countries. And they've got free range then for their nuclear submarines and surface ships based in Taiwan through the whole Indo-Pacific region. So that geopolitically, it'd be a disaster if China took Taiwan. Number two, it goes to your point of the chips. 90% of our the small 5 nanometer and less chips, silicon chips, are made by TSMC in Taiwan. And if China has not been able to replicate that industry, unlike many other industries that they've been able to replicate in their own country, if they got control of those TSMC factories and research facilities, they'd be the new OPEC of silicon chips and control the world economy. Now, let's face it, that's never going to happen. I mean, the United States and its allies are never going to let those factories fall into Chinese hands, even if there was a successful invasion of Taiwan. I mean, you're looking at something similar to what happened with the French fleet when Vichy France surrendered to Germany. The Brits didn't allow the French fleet to remain intact so that it could have potentially gone to the Germans and changed the balance of power in the battle for the Atlantic. So
they bombed that fleet.
That fleet was destroyed, and it was look. Churchill walked into the House of Commons. He was a Francophile, with tears streaming down his face because it was the hardest decision he made in the war, and yet he was greeted by unanimous applause as he entered the House because they understood how important that was to the future of Great Britain and the ability to continue the struggle against Nazi Germany. And again, I think you'd have a very similar situation here. I don't think TSMC factories, research facilities, things of that nature fall into the Chinese hands, even if they were somehow successful in the invasion.
They would be gone, is what you're saying. They would be gone if the Chinese successfully took Taiwan. Those facilities and production capacity would be gone. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
I can't imagine they'd be intact.
That's fascinating. One other China question is, there's been a lot of talk recently, particularly at America's southern border, with the flow of people, the flow of drugs, fentanyl. And 90% of the ingredients and production of fentanyl comes from China. Is there something we're not doing on that front that we ought to be doing? China's role in the drug and opioid epidemic in the United States is now coming more and more to light and public awareness. What are your thoughts on that front?
Well, it's a great question. It's something people have been talking about a lot recently. Two congressmen, Mike Waltz and Dan Crenshaw, one is former Special Forces officer, one is former Navy SEAL, have introduced a new authorization for use of military force for America to go in and take out the cartels that are pumping this fentanyl into America, that's killing 100,000 people a year. I mean, that's twice as many folks are dying every year that died in combat in the Vietnam War. And so it's a massive problem for the United States. It's something we addressed in the Trump administration. President Trump gave a warning to President Xi to stop it with the precursors, letting those come into Mexico. But it's now becoming not just a police cartels, unfortunately. There are no-go areas all over Mexico. These cartels are very powerful, very rich. I mean, the Sinaloa cartel is estimated to have assets of over 20 billion. Same with Jalisco New Generation. The Gulf cartel was involved in this recent kidnapping of Americans, and the Zetas are still there. So these are powerful cartels. They're going to have to be dealt with in a military fashion. That'll happen sooner rather than later. It's something that Bill Barr advocated in the Trump administration. SecDef Esper was opposed to it, and obviously it would have to be handled with diplomacy with Mexico. Mexico is not going to like it. They believe in their own sovereignty, as do we. But we would be doing the Mexican government a favor to take out the cartels. As far as the precursors go, look, those are coming into Mexico the same way the balloon flew over our shores. I mean, they're not getting there by magic. They're getting there by ship and by aircraft. And we're going to have to start identifying the shipping that's coming in with the precursors, and we're going to have to take measures to make sure that those ships are either turned around or they never get to Mexican shores. And so we're going to have to up our game there. And I think that's something the administration is probably looking into now. But the Mexicans are going to have to up their game. We're going to have to up our game because we can't continue to lose 100,000 Americans a year to this fentanyl crisis that, as you know, is originating in China.
Let's switch tracks for a minute and go to your previous role long ago as Special Envoy for Hostage Affairs. I recently did an interview with the Atlantic Council with the mother of James Foley, Diane Foley, and the James Foley Foundation, and also Paul Whelan's sister. Paul Whelan is currently detained in Russia and held in Russia. And it was looking at wrongfully detained persons in the around the world. And if you look at it and the aggregate, this is a booming industry for someone. It is increasingly dense in terms of all sorts of Americans and others being taken. And the big shift, Robert, is not that they are just terror groups and non-state actors. They are state actors. And I'd just love to get your insights on whether we're creating incentives for government to get in this business. And are we responding the wrong way? What should we be doing in our playbook to create disincentives for the hostage business, if you will?
Yeah, so another great question. These are very hard cases, and I know Diane Foley well. She's and Dr. Foley. They're great Americans, and lost a son, as you know, to ISIS, who was just brutally beheaded. And it was a great young man, great young journalist. So she's doing really terrific work. Her and her family started the foundation, and they're assisting the families of current hostages and detainees. With respect to the Whelan family, I mean, I felt that was a personal failure of mine that both as a hostage envoy and as a national security advisor, I couldn't get Paul Whelan out. I mean, we thought we had a deal with Patrushev, the Russian national security advisor, after a summit I conducted with him in October of 2020, to get both Trevor Reed, who was let out, and Paul Whelan out. And unfortunately, after the election, when we lost, the Russians did not go forward with the deal that we thought we had, and Paul is still there, and we need to work very hard to get him out. Your big question, though, is how do we disincentivize governments from taking hostages? And you've got three governments a lot of governments have been involved in this, but certainly China with visa exit bans. Iran has been doing this for many years and has kind of written the playbook for other governments, and now Russia's getting involved. And it's a terrible practice. I think it should go down like piracy and slavery, and genocide is a universal crime, hostage taking. So I think we need to make sure that governments that engage in this sort of behavior pay a price, either through banning travel to those countries. I mean, I think China would take a very different view of how they do their exit bans if we said no more Americans are coming to China. It'd be very difficult for them to do business. And certainly with Russia, we've got less leverage now with the war going on, and not many Americans are traveling to Russia. But we need to make sure that there's a price that's paid, and not just so we're not just focused on swapping prisoners or making concessions that merely encourage further hostage taking and further wrongful detention. So we've got to have a whole toolkit of policy.
Thank you for that. And now let's take a look at the Middle East for a minute. We're doing this conversation. It's anchored in a conference that Ali Soufan and the Global Security Forum are doing in Doha. And, Qatar is in a complicated neighborhood. Iran is next door. Your administration pulled out of the JCPOA. Iran is now enriching uranium at very high levels. And I guess when you kind of look at the growing probable tension, what's the security course for some of these countries, particularly Qatar? I should note this week, I noted that the Saudi foreign minister was in Moscow being greeted by Sergei Lavrov. And so when you sort of look at the hedging strategies, part of those hedging strategies are hedging strategies worried that the United States is not going to be there with them. And so I'm just interested in how you see that.
Well, look, with respect to Qatar, the Biden administration made Qatar a major non-NATO ally, which I applauded and was in favor of, and I think that's great news for people in Doha and people in the Emirate of Qatar. I think that Qatar has a major U.S. military base, Air Force base there that provides real security, as does our other Gulf allies, Bahrain and UAE and Saudi. At the end of the day, it's the U.S. that's going to provide them with the security they require. Excuse me. Look, when Kuwait was invaded by Iraq, even though they'd often had Kuwaiti vessels flagged as Russian ships and had relations with Russia and China, China and Russia didn't come to their aid. It was the United States of America that came to their aid. And I think the countries in the Gulf know that if their security is threatened by Iran or another nation, the only real security guarantee they have is the United States. Now, the fact that Saudi and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and other countries maintain cordial relations with Russia and China, other governments, that's to be expected. We don't date countries exclusively. We have great diplomatic relations with a number of countries, and they have diplomatic relations with other countries. But at the end of the day, I think that the Qataris and the Emiratis and the Saudis and Bahrainis and others understand the only real security assurance they have from the outside is from the United States of America and our allies. And that includes Israel. That's why I think the Abraham Accords is playing such a critical role now in deterring Iran. Is that you're seeing the increased cooperation economically, diplomatically, but also militarily between the Emirates and Bahrain and Israel. And I think it's time that Saudi and Qatar join the Abraham Accords and get closer to each other as GCC countries, but also get closer with Israel. In fact, the GCC might want to invite Israel to join. I mean, that would be a great move.
Well, I mean, that would be really interesting because it would tie, since it's a real superpower. I know you're going to take a drink of water. I've been in that same position. But, let me ask you, as you kind of look at that security, you talked about NATO. Are you worried at all? I mean, I just, we don't have a few minutes left, and I've got a zinger question to ask you before we finish. But I guess I'm interested in transatlantic euphoria, that the relationship is strong and vibrant and filled with purpose, dealing with Russia, dealing with threats. But it took an invasion of Russia, of a sovereign country, for that just a few years ago, French President Emmanuel Macron called NATO brain dead. He said we need strategic autonomy in Europe and independence of action. And I'm just interested in how real or fragile our own sense of alliances is. And because if you're dependent upon shock so that you find your purpose with our European and French and British and German friends, I'm just interested in whether or not that's a really, something to feel good about.
Well, look, sometimes good things come from bad. The silver linings of clouds, and one of the silver linings from the Ukraine invasion is that NATO's gotten stronger and has a renewed sense of purpose. Look, we had to put a shock to NATO in 2019 when President Trump used some very tough language with NATO to get them to increase their defense spending. And at that summit in December of 2019, the NATO countries agreed to spend $400 billion over 10 years. Now we're 4 years into that, and that increased spending has in part allowed and improvements in the weapon systems of those countries has allowed them to shift some of their older systems to Ukraine. So there was a benefit from the shock of President Trump actually making and demanding that the Europeans burden share and pay their fair share. And there's a benefit to the shock in Ukraine. I think the biggest benefit is Finland and Sweden joining NATO. Finland has a very, very competent army, 250,000 strong, and Sweden has a very accomplished Navy, and so especially the submarine force. That's going to allow the U.S. to redeploy assets from Europe into the Indo-Pacific. So that's bad news for Russia and bad news for China. But the final point I'll make is, we shouldn't clap ourselves on the back too much and take too much pleasure in how well NATO is responding. It's doing a good job, and I've complimented the Biden administration, in fact, on rallying the West in response to the invasion. but it's the Ukrainians that are doing the fighting and dying. So NATO is performing well. It's unified. It's sending a strong message, I think, to the Russians. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we don't take credit for what the Ukrainian people are doing.
Let's just jump to the Indo-Pacific again before I ask my zinger. The Quad in Asia, we see Japan becoming closer, remarkably, to Korea. Korea is not a formal member of the Quad. We see Japan committing to 2% of GDP in security and defense spending, which is, for a guy that's been involved with Japan, is a remarkable step. But there was, big country like Vietnam, another big country. Is the Quad the right frame for American security strategy in the Indo-Pacific, or are we getting lost in the complexity there and not putting together something that's a compelling alliance, if you will, given China's growing interest in the region?
Well, look, we thought the Quad was critical in the Trump administration. That's why President Trump visited Japan and had such a strong relationship with Abe-san, the former prime minister who was tragically assassinated. It's
Right.
why at the outset of COVID, we took a trip to India to go see Prime Minister Modi. It's why we held a state dinner for Scott Morrison, the then Prime Minister of Australia. And that was something that I talked to Jake about extensively during the transition. And I was really pleased to see that the first foreign head of state to visit the White House was Prime Minister Suga, the then Prime Minister of Japan. And the first multilateral engagement the president had was with the Quad. And so I think if you're looking at this from Beijing's standpoint, and you watch how quickly Sweden and Finland, which had long histories of neutrality, jumped into NATO after the invasion of Ukraine, you could see the Quad becoming a formal alliance if the Chinese invade or attempt to course a unification with Taiwan. But also it could grow, and you could easily see the countries you mentioned. I could easily see South Korea, Vietnam, which is not a democracy but believes in sovereignty and its own independence. The Thais, the Filipinos, and even New Zealand, which has had some issues because of nuclear policy, all joining the Quad, and you could end up with a very, very vigorous and robust alliance in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's something that China gets, just like Russia got a bigger NATO. China gets that if they invade Taiwan.
Well, let me ask you finally. I hope to put you on the spot. The rumors out there in the press are that Robert O'Brien might be the next senator from Utah. Are you thinking of running for the Senate or anything else?
No, listen, it's always flattering to have people approach you and kind of put your name in the ring. Utah's got two great senators with Mike Lee, the senior senator, and Mitt Romney is the junior senator. I don't know what Governor Romney's plans are, if he'll run again or not, but there are lots of people lining up to look at that seat. And we have a home in Utah, and I love Utah very much, but I'm not running for anything, including dog catcher. I think there are.
You're saying there's smoke but no fire?
Plenty of good candidates out there for various positions, and I'll support our GOP nominees both for president and for Senate in Utah and Senate in California. So, at some point, if someone asks me to serve, I'd always salute and do what the president asks. But I'm not running for any office at this point. But thank you for.
So we may see you back in public service, at least in Washington.
Well, that'll be up to
or
somebody
around
else,
the world.
So that'll be up to somebody else. But it was an honor to serve, and I'm enjoying the private sector now, and we'll see what happens.
Well, Ambassador Robert O'Brien, I always really enjoy our conversations and learn a lot. Thank you so much for joining us today at the Global Security Forum, and we wish you well in the decision not to run for the Senate in Utah. But in case you change your mind, please give me a call.
Well, great to be with you, and great to be with all my friends in Doha. God bless the United States, and God bless everyone in Qatar.
Thank you.